The harshness of Roman military discipline became a household name. By enlisting in the military, a Roman citizen escaped the protection of customary law and became subject to the authority of the military commander. Order in the army was imposed by iron and blood, and death awaited violators of discipline. There were no indulgences, even if the perpetrator was related to the commander. This conscious cruelty was one of the foundations of high combat effectiveness of the Roman army. Among historians, the idea of a fundamental difference between civil and military law in the Romans has been established. The first acted on the territory of the city and was determined by the letter of the law. The second began beyond the first mile post from the city walls, and here the will of the commander reigned indiscriminately. His power over the bodies and souls of his subordinates was absolute. Not without reason one of its symbols Romans considered fascia, that is, tied with a belt a bundle of slings, which were solemnly worn in front of the commander lictors. Outside the city walls, an axe was put into the fascia, which symbolized the right of the commander to pass death sentences. In the territory of Rome, the death penalty was limited to the right of provocation, that is, the possibility of the condemned to appeal for intercession to the people's assembly. However, when the army went on campaign, this right ceased to apply to citizens who became soldiers. After the declaration of war, the usual norms of civil life in Rome were suspended. The courts were closed, the people's assembly stopped meeting, and trade ceased. Even the very civil status of soldiers was alienated as if, being enrolled in the army, citizens were deprived of basic rights and were subject to imprisonment, corporal punishment and even execution by order of the commander. This peculiarity of civil law life was willingly used by the Roman Senate, which during plebeian unrest, usually under the first convenient pretext imposed martial law, mobilized the discontented in the army and thus forced them to submit. Any meetings or assemblies in the army were forbidden on pain of death. On the other hand, this same peculiarity led to the fact that the famous plebeian secessions usually began with a revolt of the army, which refused to submit to the commander and then withdrew in full order to the Holy Mountain 3 miles from the city. The state of emergency and the warlord's unlimited power ended when the army returned from the campaign and entered within the city walls. If the campaign was victorious, it took the form of a triumphal procession. The commander entered the city in a chariot and then ascended to the Capitol, where he offered a solemn sacrifice to Jupiter. He was followed in the procession by the soldiers serving under him, who went through the rite of purification of weapons. A sign of the transition from military to civilian state was the formal address to the citizens of Rome, quirites. It was believed that this word alone in the mouth of the commander freed the soldiers from their oath. As a symbol of the strict military discipline inherited from their ancestors, the Romans considered the so-called Manlius Praevesh. This is when the consul Titus Manlius Imperios ordered the lictors to behead his own son for violating his prohibition to leave the ranks and fight the enemy. Another similar case occurred when, under similar circumstances, his own son was executed by the dictator Aulus Postumius. True, Livy, telling this story, expressed cautious doubts about its authenticity. And the famous commander Lucius Papirius Cursor, acting as dictator, sentenced to death his chief of cavalry Quintus Fabius Rullianus, who, like the previous young men, in defiance of his ban entered into battle with the enemy and won. Fabius managed to escape from the hands of the lictors and escape from the camp to Rome, where he appealed to the people's assembly. In the course of heated debate among the Romans, Papirius managed to insist on his right, but at the unanimous request of the assembly favorable to Fabius, he nevertheless agreed to soften his anger and forgive his transgression. The example of Manlius righteousness is especially significant because of the conflict between the warlord's authority and paternal right. His severity, which became legendary already in antiquity, was supposed to be an example of unquestioning obedience to a discipline that would stand above all circumstances, including paternal affection for children. This tradition of blind obedience to orders was so unquestionable that any unauthorized action, even a seemingly successful one, was considered in the Roman army as much a violation of military discipline as failure to obey an order. There is no doubt that this example really served for many generations of Romans as an important benchmark against which they checked their actions in private and public life. Polybius and other Greeks described the harsh rules of the Roman army. Rarely in any other state, Polybius noted, were those guilty of indiscipline or cowardice treated with such cruelty and contempt as the Romans. It is known that the Senate repeatedly refused to ransom their soldiers who were captured by the enemy. When King Pyrrhus released Roman prisoners without ransom, the senators decided to transfer those of them who had previously served in the cavalry to the infantry, and the former infantrymen were assigned to the auxiliary squads of slingers. None of them had the right to camp overnight or sleep in tents, and they could not return to their former service except by delivering armor removed from 2 slain enemies. Soldiers of the legions defeated at Cannae transferred to Sicily, where they were to remain until the end of the war with the same prohibition to camp overnight and the replacement of wheat bread for barley. The Romans punished with particular severity for abandoning their positions during battle and desertion. The punishment for this crime was death, and often the Romans did not stop before the extermination of entire detachments. Known case with the Campanian legion, which during the war against Pyrrhus mutinied and captured the city of Regius in southern Italy. Having finished with Pyrrhus, the Romans immediately besieged and took Regius. Most of the Campanians were killed, and no more than 300 were captured. They were all sent in chains to Rome. Here they were first flogged in the Forum, and then all of them were beheaded. According to a Senate decree, the bodies of the executed were left unburied, and even their relatives were forbidden to mourn them. Sometimes decimation was carried out in the retreating units before the onslaught of the enemy. In this case, organized a general formation of the army and among the fugitives by lot selected every 10th, which immediately subjected to execution. The detachment itself was disbanded, and its soldiers were distributed among other units of the army. Disciplinary power had not only the commander, but also tribunes, prefects of allies and centurions. They had the right to impose pecuniary penalties, to arrest the guilty and to flog them. As for the responsibility for certain crimes, Cato the Elder wrote that those found guilty of theft among fellow soldiers had their right hands cut off, and if they wished to subject them to a lighter punishment, they were whipped in front of the ranks. The same guilty of crimes was subjected to caning, which was carried out by the soldiers themselves, sometimes fellow soldiers and comrades of the condemned. Having pronounced the sentence, the tribune took a stick and with it lightly touched the guilty, after which the soldiers beat him with sticks and stones, most of the time to death. If he was still alive, he was banished, and he was not allowed to return home. According to Polybius, the fear of inevitable punishment made Roman soldiers stand firm at their post, even in front of a much larger enemy. Having lost a shield or sword in battle, they like madmen threw themselves into the ranks of the enemy to either regain what they had lost or die a glorious death. Only death on the battlefield in their minds could save the soldier from the inevitable disgrace and insults from his fellow soldiers. According to the general belief of the time, idleness and inactivity of peaceful life had a devastating effect on the discipline of troops, undermined the moral and physical condition of soldiers. Hard labor, constant exercise, and long service in remote garrisons side by side with the enemy were considered necessary to keep in check the most restless contingents, which otherwise would not have been able to resist crime or mutiny on their own. At the same time, however, especially in comparison to their predecessors, the moderation of those military commanders who sought less often to resort to reprisals and more often to solve problems by personal example and persuasion became much more valued at this time. Camp justice became much more flexible. For a small misdemeanor, the perpetrator was given extra duty assignments, sent to the brig or left to sleep outside the camp walls. Those who showed cowardice or disobedience were forced to dig ditches, carry bricks, chop straw, or do other hard and dirty work. Among the punishments at that time, shaming penalties were widespread. The perpetrators were humiliated by ordering them, for example, to stand in the center of the camp all day barefoot, in clothes without a belt or cut from top to bottom, with a soot or sod in their hands. These punishments, carried out in front of fellow soldiers, appealed to the soldiers' sense of honor and were an effective means of maintaining military discipline in a professional army.